Senator Cruz, welcome back to Meet the Press. Let me just start with the state of your campaign. The best path for you as the conservative would be to win over the voters that are supporting Donald Trump and Ben Carson right now. How do you do that? How do you tell those voters, you know what, you may like those guys, but come to me?
Well, listen, I'm very encouraged where we are right now, because I think what we're seeing happening every day is conservatives coalescing behind our campaign. And you know, one of the reasons I'm very optimistic is you look at the impact of Donald Trump. I like Donald. As you know, others have gone out of their way to smack him. I haven't. I think Donald's campaign has been immensely beneficial for our campaign. And the reason is he's framed the central issue of this Republican primary as who will stand up to Washington. Well, the natural follow-up, if that's the question, is who actually has stood up to Washington. Who has stood up to both Democrats and to leaders in their own party.
You think that distinguishes you from Donald Trump and Ben Carson?
And from everyone else on that stage. I think my record is markedly different in terms of actually standing up and taking on the Washington cartel. And I think that's why we're seeing, particularly as voters get more and more educated, study the candidates, listen to the candidates in person, I think that's why we're seeing the grassroots momentum that we're seeing, is conservatives are coalescing behind our campaign.
Who's this Washington cartel? Will you give me some names? Name names. Who's in the Washington cartel?
Well, you know, as you know, a few months ago, I had a book that came out, A Time for Truth.
Right.
And I talked a lot about the Washington cartel in the book, A Time for Truth. And I described the cartel as career politicians in both parties who get in bed with lobbyists and special interest and grow and grow and grow government. So, for example, the first chapter of the book is entitled Mendacity, and it describes the inside story of what happened over the debt ceiling, and in particular, Republican leadership in the Senate urging every Republican to affirmatively consent to lower the threshold to making it easier for Barack Obama and Harry Reid to add trillions in debt. I'll tell you, when people read that first chapter, when they read what happens behind closed doors in the Republican lunch, they're outraged, and that's the volcanic rage that I think is driving this cycle. People are ticked off with politicians that make great promises on the campaign trail, but then they don't actually follow through.
But have you overpromised? You were sitting there saying that you could stop Obamacare if you just did what you did in shutting down the government, and that Republicans could stop the Iran deal. The fact is you couldn't. The numbers weren't on your side. There's a Democratic president. So did you overpromise? Because I understand you're saying others, but didn't you?
Look, when it comes to promising, what I promised is that I would fight with every breath in my body to stop the out-of-control spending and the debt that is bankrupting our country, to stop Obamacare, to protect our nation. And all of those are promises that I have honored every single day in the Senate. And you know, it's amazing. So I was visiting with a colleague recently who was making that pitch about, well, gosh, the problem is expectations. We need to define expectations.
Correct. A bunch of Republicans have been saying that.
And Chuck, it's complete,
and they blame you.
It's complete nonsense. Because you know who the people promising are? It's actually Republican leadership when they campaign. Let's rewind the clock. Go back to 2009. Republicans told Americans all across the country, if only we have a Republican majority in the House, things will be different. We won a tidal wave election, and very little changed. Then we were told, if only we have a majority in the Senate. The problem is Harry Reid in the Senate. Remember, when I was fighting against Obamacare, when I was fighting against amnesty, Republican leadership said, no, Ted, you don't understand. We can't do this without the Senate. If we retire Harry Reid, then we'll fight. 2014, millions of Americans rose up. We won another tsunami election, picked up 9 Senate seats, retired Harry Reid, have the largest majority in the House since the 1920s. And the position of Republican leadership is we can stand and fight for nothing.
Whose issue? You know, it's funny, you talk to House Republicans, they blame the Senate Republicans. You talk to Senate Republicans, they say, well, why don't the House Republicans send us a bill and we'll try to do it? Whose fault is it?
Look, it's leadership in both chambers.
So this is Mitch McConnell, John Boehner.
Why do you think John Boehner's stepping down? He's stepping down because the American people are furious with Republican leaders that don't do what they promised. And you know, it's interesting, I do town halls all over the country. And I asked folks, okay, we have Republican majorities in both houses for 10 months now. What on earth have they accomplished? Every town hall you do that, the answer is always absolutely nothing. And usually I respond, you say, you know what? It's worse than that. It would have been better if it were nothing. In fact, what the Republican majorities have done, we came back right after the last election, passed a $1 trillion omnibus bill filled with corporate welfare and pork. Then Republican leadership, and leadership joined with Harry Reid and the Democrats to do that. Then leadership voted to fund Obamacare. Then they voted to fund amnesty. Then they voted to fund Planned Parenthood. And then Republican leadership took the lead confirming Loretta Lynch as Attorney General. Now, Chuck, which one of those decisions is one iota different than what would have happened under Harry Reid and the Democrats? The truth of the matter is Republican leadership are the most effective Democrat leaders we've ever seen.
Right.
They passed more Democratic priorities than Harry Reid ever could.
All right, so John Boehner is leaving.
Yeah.
Should Mitch McConnell leave?
Look, that is a question for the Republican conference to make.
You're a member of the Republican conference.
What I have said...
Have you called, why don't you challenge him? Why don't you call for him to step down?
What I have said repeatedly, Chuck, both publicly and privately, and when I say both publicly and privately is the same thing, is we need leaders who will honor the promises we made to the men and women who elected us. So, for example, in 2014, I spent 2 months traveling the country campaigning to pick up Republican Senate seats. I think in the last 2 months of 2014 before the election, I slept in my own bed 4 or 5 nights. I stood next to Senate candidate after Senate candidate who stood up there and said, if you elect me, if you give us a Republican majority in the Senate, we will stand up and fight to stop Obamacare. We will stand up and fight to stop amnesty. That's what they said over and over again. The instant we won elections, suddenly Republican leadership says, never mind, pay no attention to those promises. Instead, what do we need to do?
Did any of those senators stand with you, though? You were by yourself.
You know,
You campaigned for Tom Cotton. You campaigned for Joni Ernst. You campaigned for these folks. They didn't stand with you, did they?
well, I'll tell you, the reason I'm running for president is what has become abundantly clear. We're not going to turn this country around from Congress. It is going to take a strong conservative in the White House. And I think the reason why our campaign is seeing incredible momentum and enthusiasm is people recognize they want someone who'll just do what he said he would do. It ain't that complicated.
Well, I go back to if you're glad that John Boehner is leaving, how come you don't call out Mitch McConnell by name?
Listen, at the end of the day...
Since he is your leader.
At the end of the day, it depends on where the votes are in the conference. Right now, Mitch has the votes to remain as majority leader. So what I'm calling on, rather than focusing on individuals, you know, what the press always wants to do is turn it into a food fight and a personality battle.
Oh, I think it became a food fight in the House without us.
But listen,
fair enough. I mean, would you agree with that?
But from my end, I don't think it's about any individual person. I don't think the voters are interested in politicians bickering like children. What they're interested in is solving the problems in this country. And right now, the voters feel like Charlie Brown with Lucy and the football. At every stage, Republicans promise, we can't do it now, but next time. And you know what? They say now, well, we don't have 60 in the Senate. If we don't have 60, well, we don't have 67. You know what? We've never had 67. It's constantly a moving target. And here's the divide. So I was meeting with some House conservatives a couple of weeks ago, and I suggested to each of them, I said, look, go back to your districts. Bring together a town hall. Put up a whiteboard. And just ask the men and women we work for, what should be the top priorities of the Republican majorities in Congress? If you write down 20 priorities that come from the people we work for, I guarantee you 18 of them are nowhere to be found on leadership's priority list. Then, Chuck, but do the other half of it. Go down to K Street in Washington, get the top lobbyists in Washington together, put up the whiteboard, ask them their top priorities. 18 of those priorities are the priorities of Republican leadership. You know what? They're also the priorities of Democratic leadership. What we have in effect, the Washington cartel, it's the party of Washington. Grow government, grow debt, grow Washington power. You know, 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America are in and around Washington, D.C. That's why people are fed up, because what we say on the campaign trail is not what politicians in Washington are doing.
Let me ask you this. So why should Americans trust any Republican to become president? Because you have basically said the Republican Party has been terrible at leading the House, terrible at leading the Senate, and in the last debate, you were pretty critical of both previous Republican presidents, President George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush. So you're basically saying Republicans didn't do a good job the last time we had the keys to all of this stuff, but vote Republican anyway?
Well, and let's be clear, I'm not advocating Republican congressional leadership for president. They have demonstrated that they're not honoring the promises they made. I think the test that primary voters are applying is who has actually walked the walk. And it's the reason why. Let me give a couple of examples of what we're seeing on the grassroots, Chuck. Mm-hmm. Just this weekend, in the state of New Hampshire, where you and I are sitting right now, the 603 Alliance, which is the gathering of all of the major conservative leaders in the state of New Hampshire, voted. They had their straw poll on who to endorse. We won with 72% of the vote, overwhelmingly seeing conservatives unite. A month ago, FreedomWorks, the national grassroots organization, had their national convention. It was in Florida, the backyard of two of the candidates, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio. We won their straw poll with 42% of the vote. 2 weeks later, the Value Voter Summit, we won that with 35% of the vote. Now, what's encouraging about that also is they're all across the spectrum of the Republican primary base. So FreedomWorks trends more libertarian and Tea Party. Value Voters trends more evangelical and socially conservative. And it is exceptionally unusual to see that depth of support at the grassroots across the country and across the spectrum of that old Reagan coalition.
I'm trying to figure out, though, how you're going to unite your party, because I'm just going to read you quotes from your fellow Republicans. Senator Lamar Alexander said this about you. In kindergarten, you learn to work well together and play by the rules. Another thing you learn in kindergarten is to respect one another. Senator Orrin Hatch. Squabbling and sanctimony may be tolerated in other venues or perhaps on the campaign trail, but they have no place among colleagues in the U.S. Senate. John McCain. I would never contemplate going to the floor of the Senate impugning the integrity of another senator. Just not something we do here. This was about what you said about Mitch McConnell. And of course, Speaker Boehner called you a false prophet, and another word that I'm not going to say on Sunday morning television. How do you unite this party? How do you lead a Republican Party when Orrin Hatch, Lamar Alexander, John McCain, John Boehner, these are well-respected men, think this lowly of you?
Listen, if you're looking for a candidate who the career politicians in Washington will embrace, I'm not your guy. Washington's broken. People are frustrated out of their minds. Everyone in the Republican primary is standing up saying, vote for me because I will stand up and fight Washington. But you know, it's striking. I mean, let's step back for a second. In 2013, when millions of conservatives rose up against the disaster that is Obamacare, I was proud to lead that fight against Obamacare. You look at the other 10 men and women standing on that debate stage, none of them were anywhere to be found. In 2014, when millions of conservatives rose up against President Obama's illegal amnesty, again, I was proud to lead that fight. Again, none of the other candidates for president were anywhere to be found. But you know, Chuck, you don't have to go back to 2013 or 2014. Go back 2 weeks ago. When we had the last Republican debate in California, almost every Republican candidate looked in the TV camera and said, we should defund Planned Parenthood. 2 weeks ago, we had an epic, knockdown, drag-out fight on exactly this. Millions of conservatives rose up, said, defund Planned Parenthood. Again, I was proud to lead that fight. And where were the other candidates? It was like they were in the witness protection plan. Can you imagine how different that fight would have played out if all 11 Republican presidential candidates had descended on Washington and said in one voice, Mitch McConnell and John Boehner, don't send $500 million of taxpayer funds to Planned Parenthood?
You know, there's another way to look at this, Senator Cruz, which is you stood up on Obamacare, you stood up on Planned Parenthood, you stood up on immigration, and nobody follows you.
Well, that's
I'm just saying, nobody in Washington follows you.
Look,
you have to, if you get elected president, you got to get somebody to follow your lead in Washington, whether you like it or not.
Listen, at the end of the day, it's not about Republican leadership. And by the way, in each of those fights, just about every time we've had a battle between me and leadership with the Republican caucus, about half of the caucus has been with me, about half of the caucus has been with leadership. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, if you're looking for someone who's running to be a member of the club, that's not me. You know, it's interesting, you were reading all the attacks.
Yeah.
You know, I mentioned my book. My book, I quote all of the nasty things Republicans have said about me. And you know, in response to that, I don't reciprocate, much to the annoyance of many in the media who want me to attack Donald Trump, want me to attack Mitch McConnell, want me to attack John Boehner. I don't attack any of them.
Well, you called Mitch McConnell a liar.
Well, let's be clear what I said.
That's a tough thing to say on the Senate floor.
Well, let's be very clear what I said. I stood up and said, Mitch McConnell made the following promise, directly to me, looking me in the eye, to every other Republican senator, and he did it publicly. And then just a month later, his behavior was exactly 180 degrees to the opposite. And this is how broken Washington is. Listen, the fact that he told a falsehood is a matter of public record. He stated it publicly, then he behaved exactly the opposite. And Washington is so broken that they treat someone saying the Republican leader just did exactly the opposite of what he promised he would do, that apparently the troublemaker is the person saying it rather than the person telling the lie. That's what's broken about Washington. When I tell you I'm going to do something, Chuck, I'm going to do exactly what I said I would do.
I want to do two more things about this Washington. Is Paul Ryan a true conservative?
Oh, listen, I like Paul Ryan. He's a friend of mine. This is obviously a question that is wrapped up in the Speaker of the House deliberations. I have said consistently, I'm going to stay out of that. I'm going to leave that for the House Republican conference. Oh, that's a decision for House Republicans to make and for the American people.
Mark Levin, who you joked should be, said, I want Mark Levin as Speaker.
Mark Levin is definitely a true conservative.
He's true conservative. Yes. You'll say that, but you won't say Paul Ryan is. He doesn't think Paul Ryan is right now. He doesn't like his stance on the debt limit and on TARP and things like that.
I have said consistently throughout that the question of House leadership is a question for the House Republican Conference. And so I'm not going to stick my nose into it as much as people want me to. Yeah.
To stick your nose in the House, you meet with House Republicans frequently, usually at the time that they're picking new leaders or at the time that there's a big fight. So you can't say you don't stick your nose.
Hold on.
You can't say you don't stick your nose in House leaders.
Sure, I can. Listen, I meet with House Republicans and Senate Republicans all the time. And about once a month, I gather House conservatives together and we visit. And they tend to be regularly scheduled. It's interesting, actually.
Is that not meddling in House business?
Talking with House Republicans? No.
Okay.
No. Look, the two chambers of Congress should actually talk together. It doesn't happen nearly that much. When you're actually working, a minute ago you were saying no one follows your lead, and now you're complaining that people are following my lead, that conservatives are standing up. You can't have it both ways. And let me tell you why the American people are ticked off. The American people are ticked off because politicians in Washington are not getting serious about solving the problems in this country. They focus on corporate welfare and poor. So, for example, Republican leadership joined arm in arm with Harry Reid, crawling over broken glass to try to reauthorize the Export-Import Bank, a classic example of cronyism and corporate welfare.
Not everybody thinks that that's
but they don't. It's hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer-guaranteed loans to a handful of giant corporations. I can tell you, if you do
a bunch of other countries do it. I understand. I don't want to get down.
You're right that other countries do it, and I don't believe that America's economic policy should emulate China. Yes, there are other countries that subsidize and are controlled by giant corporations and subsidize them. America shouldn't. And my point is very simple.
What if it makes an American company less competitive around the world?
My point is very simple. If you go and look at the men and women who elected us, if you go to those town halls I suggested, nobody will say, what we want is billions more cronyism and corporate welfare. That's not what they say. And interestingly enough, by the way, House leadership and Senate leadership, they don't campaign on these issues. They don't go out and say, vote for us and we'll have more corporate welfare. They campaign pretending to be conservatives. And then it's their position once they're governing, and always their voice drops an octave when they say governing. Governing in Washington speak means joining with the Democrats to grow government and bankrupt our kids even more. I think what we need to do is behave the same the day after the election as we did the day before. Whatever promise you made. Now, if you went out as a member of Congress and you campaigned saying, I'm going to grow government, I'm going to join with Democrats to do nothing on Obamacare, to do nothing on amnesty, then fine. Then I respect that you fight to do that, but that's not what most Republicans in both houses do. They campaign saying they will fight for the people, and they don't do it. It's why people are ticked.
I want to move to foreign policy, the Afghanistan decision by the president. In favor of it?
Well, listen, it's a recognition that what the president has been saying for years, that al-Qaeda is decimated, was never true. That it was political spin. The reality is we live in an incredibly dangerous world, and sadly, the failures of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy have made the dangers
If you become president, though, you're going to keep this policy in place of keeping those troops there in Afghanistan?
It will depend on the mission. I don't believe we should be engaged in nation building. I don't believe we should be trying to transform foreign countries into democratic utopias, trying to turn Iraq into Switzerland. But I do think it is the job of our military to protect this country, to hunt down and kill jihadists who would murder us. And so the judgment about Afghanistan needs to be driven by military circumstances on the ground of where we need to be able to project power and take out al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, to take out...
So you're a counterterrorism guy. You're basically saying you'll have smaller footprints to do counterterrorism, but you're not going to have big troop deployments.
I think that is exactly right, and it should be mission-driven. And by the way, that's where most Americans are, is they want to actually... You know, at the last debate, I said it's very simple, that if you elect me, we'll repeal Obamacare, kill the terrorists, and defend the Constitution. At the end of the day, that's where most Republicans are. It's where most Americans are. And I think it's basic common sense. Let's solve the problems, bring back economic growth and jobs, and bring back the Bill of Rights protecting our liberties.
Syria, priority, Assad out of power or ISIS?
ISIS, ISIS, ISIS.
So basically, table the Assad discussion right
Look,
now.
we have no business sticking our nose in that civil war. And there are a lot of politicians, including Hillary Clinton on the left, and including quite a few of the Republicans running for president on the right, who want us to get in the middle of that civil war.
So you're no on the no-fly zones, none of that stuff.
Look,
stick to just ISIS. Would you work with the Russians? If they are helping with ISIS, would you help? Would you work with them?
We shouldn't be partnering with the Russians. Look, this is a great example of the utter failure of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy. This void in power has let Putin step in there. There are a couple hundred Cubans right now, with a major Cuban general fighting in the Syrian civil war. You've got Iran, you've got General Soleimani in bed with the Russians. So you've now got Russia, Cuba, and Iran, all arm in arm. And anyone who believes Russia is fighting against terrorism, I got a bridge to sell.
Well, they're propping up Assad, but you just said you're okay with that because you're saying.
Look, I don't think we should prop up Assad either. But here's the problem: you have people who view foreign policy. You look at some of the Republicans, for example, who supported Hillary Clinton's disastrous Libya policy. Look, toppling Gaddafi. Gaddafi was a bad guy, but you know what? Libya is an absolute chaos and war zone where jihadists are battling back and forth. And here's, Chuck, the way we should answer.
By the way, would the Middle East be more stable today if you had the strong men?
Of course
there?
It would. Of course it would. It wasn't even close.
Gaddafi, Saddam, Assad, if they're strong men, they keep stability?
It wasn't even close that Libya under Gaddafi was better for U.S. interests than the chaos now that is allowing jihadists to gain strength.
What about Iraq under Saddam?
It wasn't even close.
What about Iraq under Saddam?
It wasn't even close that Egypt under Mubarak was a much stronger ally than it was under Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. And now you have President al-Sisi. You know, one of the things that I've talked about many times, President al-Sisi, I'm very glad he's leading Egypt. He's been one of the most courageous Middle East leaders. He gave an amazing
Not exactly
speech.
a democratic leader. You're
No.
okay with that. You pick stability over democracy.
The touchstone of U.S. foreign policy should be our national security interests. And, you know, I quote in the book I had that came out a few months ago, I quote a speech that al-Sisi gave on January 1st at Cairo University, the same university that Obama went to on his apology tour, where he said, astonishingly enough, that Iran had a right to nuclear power. President al-Sisi at Cairo University gave an incredibly courageous speech where he called out radical Islamic terrorists. And President al-Sisi is a Muslim. He called out ISIS. He called out the Islamists. Now, that was a brave and important speech for a Muslim leader to do. He was very much taking his own life in his hands. You better believe the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS and the jihadists are trying harder to murder him. And what does it say when the president of Egypt shows more courage in fighting the Islamists than does President Obama, who sadly at times acts like an apologist for radical Islamic terrorists?
I want to go back to the Iraq question. Do you think Iraq would be more stable today under a strong man like Saddam?
You know, look, Saddam was a more complicated question based on, I was not in Congress when we went to war, so I did not look at the intelligence at the time. Based on what we know now, should we have gone into Iraq? No, of course not. It was based on the belief that they had weapons of mass destruction that they would use against us. If that's the case, that if we believed that they were in a position to act against us and murder Americans, then we're justified in protecting ourselves.
Bottom line, autocracies and strongmen are probably better in the Middle East as far as you're concerned?
Look, it depends. And if you look to the example of Reagan, Reagan would speak out against human rights abuses. I don't think we should do what Obama and Hillary do, which is quietly whitewash human rights abuses. You know, when President Xi of China was here, I spoke out loudly, as I've done repeatedly, against China's human rights abuses. The Democrats don't want to do that. We can speak out against human rights abuses, but we shouldn't be toppling governments and putting in place even worse zealots who want to murder us. And I'll note, by the way, in the presidential race, I think foreign policy and national security is going to be front and center. I think it may well be the most important issue in the primary and also the most important issue in the general. And when it comes to this catastrophic Iranian nuclear deal, I've led the fight against it. You know, you look at the rest of the
deal's in place.
Well, it doesn't have to be, and it's part of where Republican leadership is not honoring the promises they made. Number one, I sent a detailed letter to both Mitch McConnell and John Boehner laying out how under present law they could block the deal. They're not interested in doing it. On the continuing resolution, if we actually believed what we said, what leadership should have done and what I advocated is put in the continuing resolution a prohibition on funding this catastrophic deal, sending $100 billion to Khamenei. If we really believe that Khamenei will use that $100 billion to murder Americans, there's no more important obligation we have than to stand up and protect that. But Republican leadership, at every juncture, Democrats fight tooth and nail, and Republicans enter the fight by surrendering peremptorily right at the front.
I'm going to make this final question. Debt limit's coming up.
Yeah.
You are a believer in using the debt limit for leverage. What do you want Republican leadership to do with the debt limit?
Well, listen, history, number one, is on my side.
No, I understand that.
Of
That's
the
right.
last 55 times
about half of them. Yep.
Congress has raised the debt limit, 28 times it's attached meaningful conditions.
So what do you want to see attached to it?
So what I argued in the
priority?
fight we just had was two things: preventing $500 million from going to Planned Parenthood and being used to violate the law and commit the crime of illegally selling the body parts of unborn children, and prohibit funding to this catastrophic Iranian nuclear deal. That's what I argued.
So you want that on the debt limit?
You know, to be honest, what I'd like to see on the debt limit is Republican leaders fight for something. For Pete's sakes, anything. So, for example, one of the things that I've argued for repeatedly is Rob Portman's legislation prohibiting government shutdowns, Pat Toomey's legislation taking off the table the possibility of a default. I call it the Default Prevention Act. Those would be perfectly sensible things to put on there to say, we're going to stop the Democrats from scaremongering, from fear-mongering, and threatening a default by providing that, if a continuing resolution isn't passed, that funding continues ratcheting slowly down. That's Portman's legislation.
Right.
Or if the debt ceiling isn't raised, we will always, always, always pay our debts. I will note on this show, when I was brand new in the Senate, I was on this show with Chuck Schumer. We were talking about the debt ceiling then. And I turned to Chuck and I said, hey, how about we join together in supporting the Default Prevention Act? Let's shake our hands. We can make national news right now. Bipartisan agreement, because he was talking about how terrible a default would be. I said, I agree. Let's make it right now today. We can take it off the table forever. And Chuck, actually on this show, promised he would look at it. Well, he's been looking at it for 2.5 years. He still hasn't supported it.
All right.
And here's the bottom line. People are frustrated that Republican leadership isn't fighting for anything. You know, there are a lot of reports right now that John Boehner, before he steps down as Speaker, intends to cut a deal with Nancy Pelosi to raise the debt ceiling and to fund all of Obama's agenda.
And what will you do if that
for
happens?
the next year and a half? Listen, he's got the votes.
There's nothing. That's if he's got the votes. Isn't that how democracy works?
But it's
he's
not
got
supposed
the votes.
But
I mean, this is how it works.
You're right. And if he does it, he will be the most effective Democratic leader in modern times. Because the Republican Speaker of the House shouldn't be passing legislation with all the Democrats and a handful of moderate Republicans. That's what they're doing right now. If you look at, it's interesting. Mitch McConnell's office recently put out a press release with all the quotes from Democrats praising his leadership. There's a reason on contested bill after contested bill, he gets the support of all the Democrats because he's supporting their priorities, and Republican leadership is rolling over a majority of Republicans over and over and over again. And they're also, listen, it is Republican leadership who is fighting against, not Obama, fighting against conservatives. And let me tell you, Chuck.
Actually, I think they're fighting against you.
Well, but at the end of the day, it's not about me or anyone else. It's about the millions of people across this country who we made promises to that we need to honor. And that's the reason, for example, that our campaign for president is getting such enormous support. You know, everyone just filed their fundraising reports. Right. Out of all 17 Republican candidates who started, out of all of them, the one with the most cash on hand is our campaign, $13.8 million. We've got $3.5 million more dollars in the bank than Jeb Bush. If I'd have said that 6 months ago, you would have said I was off my rocker insane. Right. But the reason is we had over 360,000 contributions, people all over the country, going to tedcruz.org. That's the strength of the campaign, is the grassroots.
If I don't end this interview now, your campaign staff is not going to be happy with me. Senator Ted Cruz, thanks very much, sir.
Thank you, Chuck.
You got it.